And at Fort Hood, Texas, a military judge is considering whether to delay the trial of Army psychiatrist Major Nidal Hasan until December. Hasan is charged in a shooting rampage at Fort Hood in 2009 that left 13 dead and 31 others wounded. If the postponement is granted, it would be the third time Hasan's trial has been delayed. Hasan could face the death penalty if convicted.
It was a Thursday afternoon, November 5th, 2009. Inside the Soldier Readiness Processing Center at Fort Hood, Texas, the largest Army base in the United States, hundreds of soldiers stood in line. Some were joking with each other. Some were filling out paperwork. Most were thinking about their families, their children, their wives, their husbands. They were getting ready to deploy to Afghanistan and Iraq. Some of them would not come back. Nobody in that room was carrying a weapon. Base policy didn't allow it. These were trained soldiers, and at that moment, they were completely defenseless. At exactly 1:34 in the afternoon, a man in a United States Army uniform walked through that door. He walked to the front desk, asked for someone by name. Then he bowed his head, slowly. He quietly, like a man saying his final prayer. He lifted his head. Nobody moved. Nobody suspected a thing. Because this man was one of them. He wore the same uniform. He held the rank of major. He was their doctor, their psychiatrist. A man the United States Army had spent years training, funding, and trusting. He reached into his clothing, pulled out a weapon, shouted 3 words, and opened fire. 146 rounds. 13 people dead, 32 wounded. Among them, a woman 9 months pregnant. Among them, a 19-year-old boy on his very first assignment. Among them, a woman who had promised her mother after September 11th that she would personally take on Osama bin Laden. She never got the chance. The shooter was brought down, shot 4 times, his spine severed. He would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. He was tried, convicted on 45 counts, sentenced to death. And you would think that is where this story ends. But it doesn't. Because from his wheelchair, on death row, inside the most secure military prison in the United States, this man picked up a pen and wrote a letter to ISIS requesting citizenship and signed it, Soldier of Allah. How does a United States Army major, a psychiatrist paid entirely by the American taxpayer, become the deadliest military traitor in modern American history? What is happening with his execution right now in 2026? And why, after 17 years, is this man still alive? Stay with me. Every answer is in this video. Welcome to Beyond the Crime Scene. Today's case, the case of United States Army Major Nidal Malik Hasan. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now. This story has multiple parts, and you do not want to miss a single one. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from. We read every single one. Now, let us get into it. To understand what happened on November 5th, 2009, you first need to understand the place where it happened. Fort Hood, located just outside Killeen, Texas, a mid-sized city roughly 60 miles north of Austin. Fort Hood is not just any military base. It is the largest United States Army installation in the entire world, home to over 45,000 active duty soldiers at any given time. A city within a city. It has its own hospitals, its own schools, its own roads, its own zip code. If you live on Fort Hood, you can go days without ever leaving its gates. On that particular Thursday morning, the base looked like it always did. Soldiers in uniform moving between buildings, vehicles rolling down wide roads, the sound of boots on pavement, the organized, disciplined rhythm of military life. But inside one specific building, the Soldier Readiness Processing Center, the atmosphere was different, heavier, more emotional. Because the men and women packed into that building were not there for routine business. They were there because they were about to leave. Some were deploying to Afghanistan, others to Iraq. They were going to war, and every single one of them knew that not everyone who leaves comes back. The Soldier Readiness Processing Center is where soldiers go for their final administrative processing before deployment. Medical evaluations, paperwork, equipment checks, insurance updates. It's the kind of quiet, bureaucratic preparation that happens before men and women are sent into combat zones. It is not a glamorous place. It is a waiting room for war. And there was one more thing about that building that is critical to understand. Base policy strictly prohibited soldiers from carrying personal firearms inside. These were trained warriors, men and women who knew how to fight, who had been trained to respond to threats, who were days away from being deployed into active combat. But inside that building on that afternoon, not one of them was armed. Nobody noticed the man sitting quietly to the side. He was in uniform. He held the rank of major. He was one of them, or so they believed. He bowed his head, then he stood up, and he shouted 3 words that would change everything. To truly understand what happened that afternoon, you cannot start at Fort Hood. You have to go back, all the way back to the beginning, because Nidal Malik Hasan did not become a killer overnight. His story is one of decades, of choices made slowly, quietly, and in plain sight of people who refused to see what was right in front of them. Nidal Malik Hasan was born on September 8th, 1970, in Arlington, Virginia. His parents were Palestinian immigrants who had left the city of Ramallah in the West Bank in search of a better life in America. They found it, at least in the beginning. The family settled in Roanoke, Virginia, where they ran a restaurant. Young Nidal grew up working in that restaurant, helping his parents, learning the value of hard work. By every outward appearance, he was a quiet and unremarkable boy growing up in Middle America. After finishing high school, Hasan made a decision that would define the entire trajectory of his life. He enlisted in the United States Army, not as an officer, not as a doctor. He started at the very bottom, as an enlisted soldier. He served 8 years in the enlisted ranks before earning his commission. During those years, the Army saw something in him worth investing in. They decided to pay for his education, all of it. In 1995, Hasan graduated from Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia, with a bachelor's degree in biochemistry. He did not merely pass. He graduated with Latin honors, a distinction reserved for students in the top tier of their class. The Army had funded his degree, and now they were prepared to go further. In 1997, Hasan enrolled at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences in Bethesda, Maryland, a medical school funded entirely by the United States military, designed specifically to train doctors for service in the armed forces. The American taxpayer was investing in this man, training him, trusting him, like turning him into a physician who would one day be responsible for the mental health of soldiers returning from combat. But something was wrong from the very beginning. It took Hasan 6 years to complete a curriculum designed to be finished in 4. During those 6 years, he was placed on academic probation multiple times. His performance was inconsistent. His focus seemed to drift. But he persisted, and eventually he graduated. He earned his medical doctorate. Later, he would also earn a Master of Public Health degree. On paper, Nidal Hasan was a success story, an immigrant's son, a soldier turned doctor, a man the Army had shaped from the ground up. In 2003, he was assigned to Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C., one of the most prestigious military hospitals in the United States. He began as a psychiatry intern, then progressed to resident, then fellow. His job was to treat soldiers, men and women who had come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, broken in ways that bullets and bandages cannot fix. Soldiers carrying the invisible wounds of war, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, survivor's guilt, anxiety so severe it prevented them from sleeping, from functioning, from living. Hasan was supposed to heal them, but those who worked alongside him began to notice things they could not ignore. His supervisors gave him consistently poor evaluations. Not once or twice, consistently. year after year. Colleagues described him in their written assessments using words that should have triggered immediate intervention: disconnected, aloof, paranoid, belligerent, schizoid. These were not the words of one disgruntled co-worker. These were the documented formal observations of multiple senior military medical professionals. In 2007 and 2008, the situation became serious enough that the chief of psychiatry at Walter Reed and the chairman of the psychiatry department at the Uniformed Services University held emergency meetings specifically about Hasan's behavior. They sat in rooms and discussed whether this man was fit to practice medicine, whether he was fit to serve, whether he was a danger. And then they did nothing. Nothing was escalated. Nothing was formally reported. No one picked up the phone and called anyone who could have intervened. The meetings happened. The concerns were documented, and Nidal Hasan continued treating soldiers. But perhaps the single most alarming moment in his entire time at Walter Reed came in 2008. Medical professionals at military hospitals regularly participate in what are called grand rounds presentations, educational lectures where doctors present case studies or research to their colleagues. It is a professional exercise, an academic exercise. Hasan stood up before a room full of United States Army psychiatrists and did not give a medical lecture. Instead, he told them, his colleagues, his superiors, his fellow Army officers, that non-believers would be decapitated, or set on fire, have burning oil poured down their throats. He did not present this as a description of extremist ideology. He presented it as truth. He defended suicide bombings. He argued in front of a room full of military doctors that Muslim soldiers in the United States Army faced an impossible conflict between their faith and their duty, and that their faith must win. The room was horrified. People shifted uncomfortably. Eyes moved to the floor. When it was over, colleagues spoke to each other in whispered disbelief. Not one of them filed a formal report. Not one. And so the Army, the institution that had educated this man from the age of 18, paid for his college degree, funded his medical school, commissioned him as an officer, promoted him to the rank of major, and entrusted him with the mental health of its most vulnerable soldiers, transferred him to Fort Hood, Texas, in the summer of 2009. They were preparing to deploy him to Afghanistan. 2 days before the shooting, Nidal Hasan did something that, in hindsight, reads as a man who believed he was never coming back. He gave away all of his furniture to his neighbors. He handed out copies of the Quran to people on his street. And he distributed business cards, small printed cards that read, Nidal Hasan, MD, MPH, SOA, psychiatrist, SOA, soldier of Allah. He had been carrying that identity for years. He had simply stopped hiding it. For over 10 years, Nidal Hasan had been attending the Muslim Community Center in Silver Spring, Maryland. By all outward appearances, he was simply a practicing Muslim, a man of faith navigating life in the United States Army. But beneath the surface, his beliefs were being pulled in a direction that was becoming darker and more extreme with every passing year. The man responsible for much of that pull had a name, Anwar al-Awlaki, a Yemeni-American cleric born in New Mexico, educated at American universities, and possessing a remarkable gift for speaking to young Muslims in the West who felt caught between two worlds. Al-Awlaki was charming, articulate. He spoke perfect English and understood American culture intimately, and he used every one of those gifts to radicalize. Al-Awlaki had preached at the Dar al-Hijra Mosque in Falls Church, Virginia, the very mosque Nidal Hasan attended, from 2000 to 2002. It is worth pausing on that detail. In the same mosque, the same period, two of the September 11th hijackers, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Hani Hanjour, had also attended that mosque during al-Awlaki's time there. Hasan sat in those same pews, listened to that same voice, and something in what he heard never left him. By 2008, al-Awlaki had fled the United States and was hiding in Yemen, having fully embraced his role as a recruiter for al-Qaeda. American intelligence agencies were monitoring him closely. His communications were being tracked. On December 17, 2008, Nidal Hasan sent his first email to al-Awlaki in Yemen. That email tripped a surveillance wire already set up by the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force. They knew immediately. They had Hasan's name. They had his rank. They had his email. They began reviewing his communications over the following 6 months, from December 2008 through June 2009. Hasan sent a total of 18 emails to a man the United States government had already identified as an al-Qaeda recruiter. In one of those emails, he wrote, "I can't wait to join you." The FBI reviewed every single one of those 18 emails. Senior analysts examined them. And their conclusion, the official documented conclusion of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Joint Terrorism Task Force, was that the emails were, in their words, fairly benign. Fairly benign. 18 emails. To a known al-Qaeda recruiter. From a United States Army psychiatrist stationed at one of the largest military bases in the world. And the conclusion was fairly benign. It would go down as one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in the history of the United States military. But while the FBI was filing away their assessment, Nidal Hasan was making different preparations entirely. On July 31st, 2009, he walked into a store called Guns Galore in Killeen, Texas, just outside the gates of Fort Hood. He approached the counter and told the clerk he wanted the most technologically advanced weapon available, with the highest magazine capacity possible. The clerk showed him an FN-57 semi-automatic pistol, a Belgian-designed weapon capable of firing armor-piercing rounds, with a magazine capacity significantly larger than a standard handgun. Hasan purchased it without hesitation. He also had it fitted with 2 LaserMax laser sights, one red, one green, allowing him to aim with deadly precision in any lighting condition. He then purchased over 3,000 rounds of ammunition. 3,000 rounds. He drove to an outdoor shooting range in Florence, Texas, and he practiced, repeatedly, until he was ready. 18 emails, one FBI task force that called them fairly benign, 3,000 rounds of ammunition, and an army base full of unarmed soldiers who had no idea what was coming. The stage was set. November 5th, 2009, 1:34 in the afternoon. Nidal Hasan walked through the doors of the Soldier Readiness Processing Center at Fort Hood, Texas. He approached the front desk and asked to see Major Parrish. While he waited, he sat quietly, bowed his head. To anyone watching, he looked like a man lost in thought, or perhaps in prayer. And then he stood up. He shouted, "Allahu Akbar, God is great," and opened fire. His first shots swept the room in what witnesses would later describe as a fan-like motion. He was methodical, controlled. He had practiced for this. The room erupted into chaos, soldiers and civilians scrambling for cover behind desks, chairs, tables, anything they could find. But 2 men chose not to run. Captain John Paul Gaffani, 56 years old, from Serra Mesa, California, was a psychiatric nurse. He had dedicated his career to helping soldiers. When the shooting started, Gaffani did not duck. He charged directly at Hasan, trying to physically tackle him and end the attack. He was shot and killed before he reached him. Michael Grant Cahill, 62 years old, from Spokane, Washington, was a civilian physician assistant. He was not a soldier. He had no training for this moment. He looked around him, grabbed the nearest thing he could find in a folding chair, and charged at Hasan with it. He was shot and killed. These 2 men, one in uniform, one a civilian, ran toward the gunfire so that others might survive. They deserve to be remembered by name every single time this story is told. Specialist Logan Burnett grabbed a folding table and hurled it at Hasan. He was shot in the left hip, but survived. At one point during the attack, Hasan walked up to a group of civilians who were cowering on the floor. He swept his laser sight slowly across one man's face, holding it there for a moment, and then he moved on. He did not fire, because that man was not wearing a uniform. Nidal Hasan was not shooting randomly. He was hunting specifically for soldiers. He moved outside the building. He continued firing, then came back inside. The first law enforcement officer to arrive was Civilian Police Sergeant Kimberly Munley. She came in fast, exchanged fire with Hasan directly, and was hit, first in the thigh, then in the knee, the second bullet shattering her femur as she fell to the ground. Hasan walked over to where she lay and kicked her pistol out of her reach. Seconds later, Civilian Police Sergeant Mark Todd arrived. He shouted commands at Hasan. Hasan turned and fired, emptying his weapon. As Hasan reached for a fresh magazine, Todd fired 5 shots. Hasan went down. Todd ran forward, kicked Hasan's pistol away from his hand, and handcuffed him as Hasan lost consciousness on the ground. It was over. 146 cartridge cases were recovered from inside the building alone. The entire attack had lasted approximately 10 minutes. 10 minutes that ended 13 lives and shattered 32 others. Hasan was rushed first to Scott and White Memorial Hospital in Temple, Texas, then transferred to Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas. The 4 bullets that brought him down had severed his spinal cord. He would never walk again. Now, the 13 people who died that day deserve more than a statistic. They deserve their names spoken aloud. Michael Grant Cahill, 62 years old, from Spokane, Washington, a civilian physician assistant who charged a gunman with a folding chair so that others might live. Libardo Eduardo Caraveo, 52 years old, from Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, a major and Army psychiatrist who had come to help soldiers heal. Justin Michael DeCrow, 32 years old, each from Plymouth, Indiana, a staff sergeant, John Paul Gaffani, 56 years old, from Serra Mesa, California, a captain and psychiatric nurse who charged the shooter with his bare hands. Frederick Green, 29 years old, from Mountain City, Tennessee, a specialist. Jason Dean Hunt, 22 years old, from Norman, Oklahoma, a specialist who had been married for just 2 months. Amy Sue Kruger, 29 years old, from Kiel, Wisconsin, a staff sergeant who, after watching the September 11th attacks unfold, had promised her mother that she would personally take on Osama bin Laden. She was killed before she ever got to deploy. Aaron Thomas Nemelka, 19 years old, from West Jordan, Utah, a private first class. The youngest person killed that day, 19 years old, Michael Scott Pearson, 22 years old, from Bolingbrook, Illinois, a private first class who had quit his civilian job specifically to serve his country. Russell Gilbert Seeger, 51 years old, from Racine, Wisconsin, a captain and psychiatrist, a man who had given his career to caring for the mental health of soldiers, killed by the very colleague he shared a profession with. Francesca Velez, 21 years old, from Chicago, Illinois, a private first class. She was 3 months pregnant. Juanita Lee Warman, 55 years old, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a lieutenant colonel. Kamsi Xiong, 23 years old, from St. Paul, Minnesota, a private first class and the father of 3 children who would grow up without him. 13 people. 13 lives cut short in 10 minutes. On a base they believed was safe. By a man they believed was one of them. The 13 people who were dead, 32 who were wounded, 1 unborn child whose life never received a single formal count in the charges that followed. And the man who did all of it was alive, paralyzed in a hospital bed in San Antonio, and already thinking about what came next. Because Nidal Hasan was not finished making headlines. Not by a long shot. 4 years passed between the shooting and the trial. 4 years of legal proceedings, appeals, arguments over competency and courtroom maneuvering. 4 years during which the families of 13 dead soldiers waited for the moment they would finally sit in a courtroom and watch justice begin to move. That moment came on August 6th, 2013. The court-martial of Nidal Malik Hasan opened at Fort Hood, Texas, the same installation where he had carried out his attack. The jury was composed of 13 of the most senior military officers the Army could assemble. 9 colonels, 3 lieutenant colonels, and 1 major. Men and women who had given their lives to the uniform. Men and women who understood, more than any civilian jury ever could, exactly what had happened in that processing center 4 years earlier. But before a single piece of evidence was presented, Hasan made a decision that stunned everyone in that courtroom. He fired his civilian defense attorney John P. Galligan of Belton, Texas. Galligan had spent years preparing a defense, gathering evidence, building arguments that might, at the very least, spare his client's life. Hasan dismissed him. He would represent himself from a wheelchair and against the full weight of the United States military justice system. The moment the trial began, it became clear that Nidal Hasan had no intention of defending himself in any meaningful sense of the word. On the very first day, he stood, or rather sat, before that jury of 13 officers and delivered his opening statement. It lasted less than 2 minutes. And in those 2 minutes, he looked at the men and women who held his life in their hands and said, "The evidence will clearly show that I am the shooter." That was it. No argument. No alternative theory. No attempt to introduce reasonable doubt. He simply told the jury he did it. What followed over the next several weeks was one of the most extraordinary and painful trials in the history of American military justice. These survivors of the attack were called to the stand. Men and women who had been shot, who had watched their colleagues die, who had crawled across floors covered in blood to escape. And as they sat in the witness box and described what they had lived through, the man who had done it to them sat in his wheelchair just feet away and cross-examined them. He asked questions. He challenged their recollections. He made them relive it again while he watched. He called 0 witnesses in his own defense. 0. He presented no evidence. He made no closing argument. On August 23, 2013, the jury returned their verdicts. Guilty on all 45 counts. 13 counts of premeditated murder. 32 counts of attempted premeditated murder. Every single count, unanimous. Here, wait for 2 days, August 27th and 28th. 24 survivors and family members stood before the court and delivered victim impact statements. They spoke about the fathers their children would never know, the mothers who would never come home, the soldiers who had survived, but would carry the physical and psychological scars of that 10 minutes for the rest of their lives. They spoke about what Nidal Hasan had taken from them, and he sat in his wheelchair and showed no emotion. On August 28, 2013, the jury sentenced Nidal Malik Hasan to death by lethal injection, unanimously. Not a single officer on that panel hesitated. He was stripped of his rank. Every dollar of military pay he had earned was withheld. He was dismissed from the United States Army in the most disgraceful terms the military justice system allows. The man the Army had built from the ground up, educated, trained, commissioned, promoted, was erased from its roles entirely, and he still showed no emotion. From the Fort Hood courtroom, Nidal Hasan was transferred to the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. If you are not familiar with Fort Leavenworth, understand this. It is not a regular military prison. It is the only maximum security military prison in the entire United States. It is where the Army sends the men it considers its most dangerous, most serious offenders. The men whose crimes are so severe that ordinary confinement is not considered sufficient. Hasan arrived there in a wheelchair. He has never left it. Inside those walls, he is not addressed as Major Hasan. He is not addressed as Dr. Hasan. He holds no title, no rank, no distinction from the institution that once celebrated him. He is referred to by one name and one name only: Inmate Nidal Hasan. Every honor the Army ever gave him has been permanently erased. He is paralyzed from the waist down. The 4 bullets that Sergeant Mark Todd fired into him on that November afternoon severed his spinal cord completely and irreversibly. He will spend whatever remains of his life unable to walk, unable to stand, entirely dependent on others for his most basic physical needs. 1 week after his death sentence was handed down, on September 5, 2013, prison authorities forcibly shaved the beard Hasan had grown during his incarceration. He had grown it as a religious statement, a visible declaration of his faith and his identity. The prison took a razor to it. His former attorney, John Galligan, filed formal legal complaints on his behalf, arguing that the forced shaving violated his religious rights. The complaints went nowhere. When mental health professionals were brought in to assess him inside his cell, as they are required to do periodically for death row inmates, Hasan told them directly, without hesitation, without any apparent desire to improve his situation, "I would still be a martyr. No remorse, no regret, no acknowledgement of the lives he had ended or the families he had destroyed." In the mind of Nidal Hasan, what he had done at Fort Hood was not a crime. It was a mission. And if the United States Army put a needle in his arm, that would not be punishment. That would be the completion of the mission. And that would be exactly what he wanted. And then, in August of 2021, something happened on the other side of the world that reached all the way into his prison cell. After 20 years of war, the United States military withdrew from Afghanistan. The Taliban, the same organization Hasan had cited as his reason for the attack, the same fighters he had said he wanted to protect, swept back into power within days. The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan was restored. American flags came down. Taliban flags went up. From his wheelchair inside Fort Leavenworth, Nidal Hasan reportedly celebrated. His lawyer confirmed it publicly. Hasan was happy. The soldiers he had killed in 2009 had been preparing to deploy to Afghanistan. They never made it. And now the country they would have fought in had fallen to the very side he had chosen over them. He sat in his cell, and he was happy. But wait, it gets worse. Go back to August 28, 2014. Exactly 1 year to the day after a jury of 13 military officers sentenced Nidal Hasan to death. He is sitting in his wheelchair inside the United States disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The most secure military prison in America, surrounded by guards, monitored, contained. A man the United States government has formally condemned to die. He picks up a pen and he writes a letter. Not to his attorney, not to a family member, not to a court. He writes the letter to a man named Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-declared caliph of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, the leader of ISIS, the head of the most feared and most brutal terrorist organization on the planet at that moment in history. An organization that was at that very time burning people alive in cages, executing journalists on camera, and declaring war on the entire Western world. In the letter, Nidal Hasan, United States Army Major, commissioned officer, psychiatrist, death row inmate, formally requested to become a citizen of the Islamic Caliphate. He did not express doubt. He did not hedge his request. He formally applied for citizenship in ISIS from a prison cell on American soil, and he signed the letter, Nidal Hasan, SOA, Soldier of Allah. The man America had trained, educated, commissioned, and paid was applying for citizenship in the very enemy America was fighting. Not in secret, not anonymously, with his name, his self-proclaimed title, his identity as a soldier of a cause that had declared war on the country that had given him everything. There are moments in true crime that stop you completely, moments where you have to set down what you are reading and simply absorb what you have just learned. This is one of those moments, a United States Army major writing to ISIS from death row, asking for a passport to a caliphate, 1 year after being sentenced to die. While Nidal Hasan was writing letters to ISIS from his prison cell, the families of the people he had killed were fighting a battle of their own. A quieter battle, a slower battle, but one that cut just as deeply. For over 6 years after the Fort Hood massacre, the United States government, under official policy, classified what happened on November 5, 2009 as workplace violence. Not terrorism, not a jihadist attack, not a politically motivated mass murder carried out by a man who had declared himself a soldier of Allah, exchanged emails with an al-Qaeda recruiter, and shouted Allahu Akbar before opening fire. Workplace violence. The same category as a disgruntled employee who snaps and attacks a coworker. This classification was not a minor bureaucratic distinction. It had real devastating material consequences for every single survivor and every single grieving family. Because of that classification, the 13 families of the dead and the 32 wounded soldiers were denied Purple Hearts, the military decoration awarded to those wounded or killed in action against an enemy of the United States. They were denied combat-related special pay. They were denied the enhanced veteran benefits that flow from wounds sustained in the line of duty against a hostile force. The government had looked at what happened to them and decided officially that it did not count as combat. Staff Sergeant Alonzo Lunsford Jr. had been shot 7 times that afternoon. 7 times? One of those bullets had partially blinded him. He had survived, barely, and he had carried the physical consequences of those 7 bullets every single day since. He became the most visible face of the campaign to force the government to tell the truth about what had happened. He spoke publicly, repeatedly, insistently. He testified before Congress. He demanded that the people who had been shot defending themselves against a self-declared soldier of al-Qaeda be treated as what they were, warriors wounded in battle. Like Francesca Velez had been 21 years old and 3 months pregnant when she was killed. When prosecutors built their case against Hasan, they filed no charge for her unborn child, despite the existence of laws that would have permitted them to do so. Her death counted as 1. Her child's death counted as nothing. Amy Kruger, who had promised her mother after watching the September 11th attacks unfold that she would personally take on Osama bin Laden, had been killed before she ever got to deploy, before she ever got to keep that promise. And for 6 years, the government's official position was that she had not been killed by an enemy of the United States. She had been killed in a workplace incident. It took an act of Congress to change it. And the National Defense Authorization Act of 2015 was signed into law and included a specific provision mandating that Purple Hearts be awarded to the victims of the Fort Hood attack. The legislation forced the government to formally acknowledge what everyone had known from the first moment, that what happened at Fort Hood was an act of terrorism carried out by a radicalized soldier who had chosen his ideology over his country. On April 10th, 2015, nearly 6 full years after the attack, a formal ceremony was held at Fort Hood, Texas. Nearly 50 survivors and family members stood on the same soil where 13 of their own had been killed. And they finally received their Purple Hearts. 6 years for a recognition they had earned in 10 minutes? The military justice system does not move quickly. Anyone who has followed the legal aftermath of the Fort Hood shooting knows that the distance between a death sentence and an execution in the United States military is measured not in months, but in years, sometimes in decades. After his conviction and sentencing in 2013, Hasan's case entered the long, grinding machinery of military appeals. Each level of review required its own timeline, its own filings, its own arguments, and the years passed. On December 11th, 2020, the United States Army Court of Criminal Appeals at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, issued its ruling. All 45 convictions upheld, every count. The court had reviewed the trial record in exhaustive detail and found no basis to overturn a single verdict, and the case moved to the next level. On September 11th, 2023, the 22nd anniversary of the attacks that had helped shape Hasan's ideology, the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces issued its own ruling. The death sentence was upheld. The nation's highest military appeals court had looked at everything and concluded that Nidal Hasan should die for what he had done. One door remained: the United States Supreme Court. On March 31, 2025, the Supreme Court of the United States denied Hasan's final petition for a writ of certiorari. In the language of the law, this means the court declined to hear his case. In plain terms, it means that every legal avenue available to Nidal Hasan had been exhausted, every appeal filed, every argument made, and every court consulted. And every single one had reached the same conclusion. The legal doors were permanently, irrevocably shut. What remained was not a legal question. It was a political one. Because under Article 71 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, a death sentence handed down by a military court cannot be carried out without the personal authorization of the President of the United States. The Commander-in-Chief must sign. No President, no execution. On September 24, 2025, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth stepped before cameras and microphones and made the government's position unmistakably clear. He said, "I am 100% committed to ensuring the death penalty is carried out for Nidal Hasan. This savage terrorist deserves the harshest lawful punishment, and the victims and survivors deserve justice without delays." He then formally submitted the execution request to President Donald Trump, the final legal step required before an execution date can be set. Across the country, survivors who had waited 16 years heard those words and felt something shift. Julia Wilson had been 9 months pregnant on the morning of November 5th, 2009. She had been inside that processing center. She had survived. Her child had survived. And for 16 years, she had carried what happened in that building. In September of 2025, she told reporters, "I am 100% hoping they execute Hasan." She said she wanted it done in Texas, on the soil where he committed his crimes, near the families of the people he killed. If President Trump signs that order, what follows will be historic. The last time the United States military executed one of its own was April 13th, 1961, 65 years ago. The man executed that day was Private John A. Bennett, convicted of rape and attempted murder. Since that day, no American president has authorized a military execution. 6 decades of death sentences handed down. 6 decades of condemned men sitting in Fort Leavenworth, and not one execution carried out. Until now, perhaps. As of March 2026, no execution date has been set. The request sits with the president. The pen has not moved. The signature has not been written. Anwar al-Awlaki, the man who radicalized Nidal Hasan, who received his 18 emails, who inspired the ideology that drove him into that processing center, was killed on September 30th, 2011. 2 American Predator drones found him in Yemen and ended his life. The recruiter is gone. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the ISIS leader to whom Hasan wrote from his prison cell, the man he asked to grant him citizenship in the Caliphate, was killed in October 2019 during a raid by United States Special Forces in Syria. The Caliph is gone. Both of the men Nidal Hasan called his heroes, both dead, killed by the very military he betrayed. But Nidal Hasan is still alive. He sits in a wheelchair inside Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, paralyzed, unrepentant, still signing his name, Soldier of Allah. Still, by his own words, waiting to become a martyr. Still, apparently, happy with what he did. It is 2026. Francesca Velez has been gone for 17 years. She was 21 years old and 3 months pregnant. Aaron Nemelka has been gone for 17 years. He was 19. Amy Kruger has been gone for 17 years. She never got to keep her promise to her mother. Their families are still waiting. The survivors are still waiting. And the only thing standing between Nidal Hasan and the death needle, after 17 years, 45 convictions, 3 levels of military appeals, and a Supreme Court rejection, is one man, one pen, one signature. Comment right now and tell us, should President Trump sign that execution order, yes or no? Leave your answer below. And if you want to be here the moment that decision is made, subscribe to this channel right now, because when that pen moves, we will cover it the moment it happens. This has been the case of United States Army Major Nidal Malik Hasan, and it is not over yet. Next on this channel, the last man the United States military ever executed, Private John A. Bennett, April 13th, 1961. What happened that day? Why it stopped? And why it has never happened again. Until now. A little boy picked up the phone. He was 7 years old. He just wanted to talk to his dad. He had no idea that the call he was about to make would be the last thing he ever did. By the time the sun went down that evening, he was dead. So was his 5-year-old sister. So was his mother. And the man who killed all three of them, he was at work on his lunch break. When he decided to do it, he walked into a store, bought a machete, went back home, and waited. This was June 9th, 1994, in a quiet coastal town called Mary Esther, Florida. And here's the part that will make your blood run cold. 3 days later, O.J. Simpson's ex-wife was murdered in Los Angeles. The whole world turned its head. Every camera, every reporter, every front page. And while the entire nation was glued to O.J., this man boarded a flight to Hawaii. We changed his name and disappeared. Nobody was looking for him. Nobody was talking about him. 3 people were dead in a bathroom in Florida, and the world didn't even notice. For 4 months, he lived as a free man. And one television show changed everything. But that is not even the most disturbing part of this story. The most disturbing part? The thing that set all of this in motion was a phone call from a 7-year-old boy to his father. Welcome back to Beyond the Crime Scene. Today's case is one that the mainstream media buried, not because it wasn't horrifying enough, but because something bigger was happening at the exact same moment. This is the case of Edward James Zacharzewski II, a decorated U.S. Air Force sergeant, a husband, and a father of 2, and the man who planned and executed the murder of his entire family on his lunch break. If you are new here, welcome. This channel is where forgotten cases get the attention they deserve. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a case. And before we get into it, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from. We have viewers from all over the globe, and we love to see it. Now, let us get into it. His name was Edward James Zacharzewski II. He was born on January 31st, 1965 in Kalamazoo, Michigan, a mid-sized city in the American Midwest. The kind of place where people go to work, raise families, and live quiet, ordinary lives. Edward did not stay quiet for long. As a young man, he made a decision that millions of Americans had made before him, and he enlisted in the United States Air Force. He put on the uniform. He took the oath. And over the years that followed, he worked his way up through the ranks until he held the title of Technical Sergeant, a decorated serviceman, trusted by his country, respected by his peers. From the outside, Edward Zacharzewski looked like exactly the kind of man America was proud of. But the outside of a person and the inside of a person are rarely the same thing. In 1986, Edward was stationed in the state of Montana. He was in his early 20s, far from home, living the regimented life of a military man. And it was there, in Montana, that he met her. Her name was Pun Im. She was a South Korean woman, soft-spoken and far from her own home, navigating life in a country that was not hers. In America, means she went by a different name, one that was easier for people around her to pronounce. She called herself Sylvia. Edward and Sylvia were drawn to each other, the way 2 people sometimes are when they are both far from where they started. They were different in almost every way that mattered. Different cultures, different languages, different worlds. But in those early days, none of that seemed to matter. When Sylvia became pregnant, They made it official. They got married. And soon after, their family began to grow. Their first child was a boy. They named him Edward James Zakarzewski III. But the family had a different name for him, one that was softer, more intimate. They called him Kim. Their second child was a girl. They named her Anna. For a moment, just a moment, it must have looked like a life. But the United States Air Force does not let its soldiers stay in one place for long. Edward's orders came through, and in 1989, the family packed up everything they owned and moved to South Korea, the country Sylvia had left behind, the country she had once called home. It should have felt like a homecoming for her. It did not. What Sylvia found when she returned to South Korea was not the welcome she had hoped for. Her children, little Kim and little Anna, were mixed race, half American, half Korean. And in South Korean society at that time, mixed-race children were not embraced. They were rejected. They were stared at. They were made to feel like they did not belong anywhere. Sylvia watched her children navigate a world that refused to accept them. She watched the looks. She heard the words. And she carried that weight silently, the way mothers do, while her husband served his posting, and the years continued to pass. By 1992, Edward's time in South Korea had come to an end. New orders arrived. This time, the family was headed to the state of Florida, specifically to a small coastal city in the Florida Panhandle called Mary Esther, a quiet, sun-drenched town sitting just outside the gates of Eglin Air Force Base in Okaloosa County. They found a home. The children settled into their routines. Edward reported to the base each morning. On the surface, they looked like any other military family living out their days in a small Florida town. But behind the walls of that house, in Mary Esther, the marriage was falling apart. The years had taken their toll, the distance, the relocations, and the cultural divide that had always existed between them but had never been resolved, only ignored. Whatever had drawn Edward and Sylvia together in Montana all those years ago was no longer enough to hold them together in Florida. Sylvia made a decision. She was going to file for divorce. She was going to take Kim and Anna, leave the United States, and return to South Korea to rebuild her life with her children near her family. She had carried enough. She had waited long enough. It was time to go. She had a plan to go home. He had already decided she never would. The morning of June 9th, 1994 began like any other morning at the Zakarzewski home in Mary Esther, Florida. Edward woke up, put on his uniform, and drove to Eglin Air Force Base, the same base he reported to every day, the same roads, the same routine. But something was different that morning. Something was already turning in his mind. Because Sylvia's plans were no longer a secret. The divorce was coming. And Edward Zakarzewski had already made his own decision about what he was going to do about it. While he was at work on the base that morning, his telephone rang. It was his son. 7-year-old Kim, the little boy with the soft nickname and the whole life ahead of him, had picked up the phone and called his father. Children call their parents for all kinds of reasons. To say hello, to ask a question, to share something that happened at school. Kim called to deliver a message. He told his father that his mother was planning to file for divorce. He told his father that she was planning to take him and his sister to South Korea. He was 7 years old, which he did not know what that phone call would cost him. He could not have known. He was just a little boy passing along information, the way children do when they do not yet understand the weight of adult decisions. Edward Zakarzewski received that message. He listened, he hung up the phone, and then he went on his lunch break. He did not go to a restaurant, he did not sit in his car and breathe. He did not call a friend or stare at the ceiling or do any of the things that a man in pain might do to process what he had just been told. He drove to a store, he walked in, he found what he was looking for, and he purchased a machete. Then he drove back to the family home in Mary Esther. He walked through the front door of the house where his wife and children lived. He went to the bathroom, and he hid the machete inside, along with a crowbar and a length of rope that he had also brought with him. Then he went back to the base, finished his shift, and came home. He did not lose control that day. He did not snap in a single terrible moment of blind rage. He made a decision. He took deliberate steps to carry it out. He acquired the tools. He hid them where he needed them. He planned it, step by step, during his lunch break. And then he sat down and waited for his family to come home. When Sylvia walked through the front door of their home in Mary Esther that evening, she had no reason to believe that anything was wrong. She did not know about the machete. She did not know about the crowbar or the rope. She did not know that her husband had spent his lunch break preparing for what was about to happen. She came home. It's the way she always did. And the moment she was inside, Edward Zakarzewski attacked her. He came at her with the crowbar, striking her across the head multiple times with a force that fractured her skull. Sylvia collapsed. But he was not finished. He took the rope and wrapped it around her throat and strangled her right there in the living room of their home. Months later, in a courtroom in Okaloosa County, medical examiner Dr. Edward Harvard would take the stand and tell the jury something that silenced the entire room. At the moment Sylvia was being strangled, skull fractured, bleeding, barely able to move, she was still alive. She endured all of it while still breathing, while still conscious, while still in some part of her fighting to survive. When Edward was done with Sylvia, he moved to the next part of his plan. He called for his son. He called Kim, his 7-year-old boy, the same child who had telephoned him at work just hours earlier, and told him it was time to brush his teeth. It was a normal request, the kind of thing a parent says every night. There was nothing in those words that would have alarmed a child. Kim walked into the bathroom, and his father killed him with the machete. Then Edward called for Anna, 5-year-old Anna, the younger of the 2 children, the little girl who had barely begun to understand the world around her. He told her the same thing. Time to brush your teeth. Prosecutors would later stand before the jury and suggest something almost unbearable. That Anna may have heard what happened to her brother before her father called her name. That she may have heard the sounds coming from that bathroom. That she may have known, in the way that small children sometimes know things without fully understanding them, that something was terribly wrong. And she walked in anyway, because it was her father calling her name. Anna was killed with the machete in the same bathroom where her brother had just died. When the autopsies were performed, the medical examiner found something on both children that told its own heartbreaking story. Both Kim and Anna had defensive wounds on their arms and on their hands. Small arms, small hands, raised in the only instinct a child has when something comes toward them. They had tried to protect themselves. After Anna was dead, Zakarzewski returned to Sylvia. He dragged her body from the living room into the bathroom where his children lay. He was not satisfied that she was gone. He struck her again, this time with the machete, until there was no longer any question. 3 people, 1 hour, 1 bathroom in a quiet house in Mary Esther, Florida. Anna was the last one he called. She was 5 years old, and the last word she ever heard in her life was her father's voice saying her name. When it was over, Edward James Zakarzewski II walked out of that house. He got into his car and drove north, away from Mary Esther, away from Okaloosa County, away from the bodies of his wife and children left on the bathroom floor. He drove to Orlando, and in Orlando he boarded a flight. He flew to Hawaii. He arrived in the islands with no plan except to disappear, and disappear is exactly what he tried to do. He changed his name. From that point forward, he was not Edward Zakarzewski. He was Michael Green, a quiet and unassuming man with no history and no past. He found a place to stay through a minister who was running a religious commune. In exchange for shelter, ondad a small shack on the property. He worked as a maintenance man. He kept his head down. He did his work. He lived simply. He prayed, perhaps, and he waited to see if anyone would come looking. Back in Florida, police had found the bodies. The investigation was opened. The military was notified. Edward Zakarzewski was listed as absent without leave. AWOL, from Eglin Air Force Base. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and for the first time, his name entered the official record as a suspect. But the machinery of justice moved slowly. And in the summer of 1994, something happened that would slow it down even further. On June 12th, 1994, just 3 days after the murders in Mary Esther, a woman named Nicole Brown Simpson and a man named Ron Goldman were found stabbed to death outside a home in Brentwood, Los Angeles. Nicole was the ex-wife of O.J. Simpson, one of the most famous athletes in the United States. What followed was unlike anything American media had ever produced. Every network, every front page, every conversation in every home across the country turned to O.J. Simpson. The arrest, the white Bronco, the trial of the century. It consumed everything. And in that consuming, all-devouring media storm, 3 people who had been murdered in a bathroom in Mary Esther, Florida, were quietly forgotten. No national coverage, no outrage, no cameras outside the house on the quiet street in Okaloosa County. Just a local investigation, a missing suspect, and 3 people who deserved far better than the silence they received. For 4 months, Edward Zakarzewski lived freely in Hawaii. He woke up each morning in his shack on the minister's property. He did his maintenance work. He ate his meals. He slept. He was alive and comfortable and free, while the family he had destroyed lay buried in the ground. Nobody was looking for him on the national stage. Nobody was talking about him. The world had moved on. Then, on October 14th, 1994, a television show aired, and within 24 hours it was all over. It was the evening of October 14th, 1994. Somewhere on the island of Hawaii, a man named Michael Green was going about his evening the way he had gone about every evening for the past 4 months. Quietly, carefully, invisibly. And he was a maintenance worker living in a shack on a minister's property. A man with no traceable past, no paper trail, no reason for anyone to look at him twice. Except that tonight, the minister sat down in front of his television. And the program that came on was called Unsolved Mysteries. Unsolved Mysteries was one of the most watched true crime programs in the United States. Each week, it brought real cases, real missing persons, real fugitives, real crimes, directly into the living rooms of millions of American households. It asked the public for help. It showed faces, it told stories, and sometimes it worked. On October 14th, 1994, it told the story of a family in Mary Esther, Florida, a mother named Sylvia, a 7-year-old boy named Kim, a 5-year-old girl named Anna. 3 people murdered in their own bathroom, and a husband and father who had vanished without a trace. The minister watched, and as he watched, something shifted in his mind. The face on the screen, the story being told, the details of the case. He had heard a version of this man's story before. Not the real version, not the version with the machete and the rope and the crowbar, but a version. He had looked at this man every day for 4 months. He had given him shelter. He had given him work. He had let him live on his property. The man on the television screen was Michael Green. When the program ended, the minister did not call the police. Not yet. First, he confronted the man himself. He went to Zakarzewski, and he asked him directly whether he was the man from the television program, whether the story being told on that screen was his story, and whether the family in that bathroom in Florida had been his family. Whatever was said between them that night, whatever passed between a minister and a fugitive in the quiet of a Hawaiian evening, it was enough to make Edward Zakarzewski understand that his time had run out. On October 15th, 1994, one single day after the Unsolved Mysteries episode aired, Edward James Zakarzewski II walked into a local police station in Hawaii and surrendered himself. 4 months. 128 days of freedom, ended by a television program and a minister who recognized his face. Now there is a question that has never been fully answered, a question that is worth sitting with for a moment. Was it guilt that made him walk into that police station? He had 4 months of living as Michael Green, 4 months of prayer and quiet and maintenance work in a shack, finally broken something inside him. Had the weight of what he had done to Sylvia and Kim and Anna finally become too heavy to carry? Or was it something far more practical than guilt? Was it the simple calculation of a man who understood that the minister had seen his face, that the walls were closing in, that surrender on his own terms was better than being dragged out in handcuffs? There is no clean answer. Only he knew what was moving inside him when he walked through that door. What we do know is this. On October 25, 1994, Edward James Zakarzewski II was extradited from Hawaii back to the state of Florida. He was transported to Okaloosa County. He's where 3 counts of first-degree murder were waiting for him. 1 for each member of the family he had destroyed. He was going home, but not the way he had planned. I want to ask you something before we move forward. In the comments below, tell me what you think. Was it guilt? Was it fear? Or did the minister's confrontation simply leave him no choice? There is no wrong answer. I genuinely want to know what you think. Nearly a year and a half passed between Edward Zakarzewski's extradition and the moment he stood before a court of law. On March 19, 1996, in the Okaloosa County Circuit Court in Shalimar, Florida, Edward James Zakarzewski II entered his plea. He did not fight it. He did not claim innocence. He did not construct an alternative theory or point fingers at anyone else. When he stood before the court and pleaded guilty to all 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count for Sylvia, 1 count for Kim, 1 count for Anna, no trial, no jury deliberating on guilt or innocence. Just a man standing in a courtroom and admitting to the world that he had done exactly what the evidence said he had done. But a guilty plea does not determine punishment. That question, life or death, went to a separate hearing, a penalty phase. And what happened in that hearing was one of the most contested, most emotionally charged, and ultimately most controversial chapters of this entire case. On one side stood Assistant State Attorney Bobby Elmore. Elmore had one objective: death. He stood before the jury and laid out the case for why Edward Zakarzewski deserved to be executed. He described the murders in precise, unflinching detail. The planning, the machete purchased on a lunch break, the crowbar and the rope hidden in the bathroom, the systematic way in which Zakarzewski had moved through that house, from Sylvia to Kim to Anna, leaving no one behind. Elmore argued that this was not a crime born of passion or mental collapse. This was calculated. This was deliberate. This was a man who had decided, clearly and in advance, that 3 people needed to die. And he had made it happen. On the other side stood defense attorney Elton Killam. Killam's task was far more complicated. His client had already admitted to the murders. There was no innocence to argue. What Killam had to do was find a reason, any reason, for the jury to choose life over death. And the argument he made was one that even he described as bizarre. And Killam stood before the jury and argued that Edward Zakarzewski had not acted out of hatred or rage or a desire for control. He argued that Zakarzewski had acted out of a twisted, deeply misguided sense of mercy. He argued that Zakarzewski had genuinely believed, however irrationally, however grotesquely, that his mixed-race children would suffer unbearably if they were taken to South Korea, that they would be rejected, that they would grow up being called half-breeds, denied acceptance, denied belonging, that their lives would be defined by discrimination and pain. Killam argued that in Zakarzewski's fractured mind, he had believed he was sparing them from that suffering, that he had intended the deaths to be instantaneous, painless, an act of love, however monstrous the execution of that love had been. He called the case bizarre. He asked the jury to consider that Zakarzewski was a decorated veteran, a man who had served his country, a man whose mind had been broken by circumstances that went beyond simple evil. The prosecution found this argument insulting. The families found it unbearable. The jury deliberated. On March 31st, 1996, they returned their sentencing recommendation. For the murder of Sylvia, 7 jurors voted for death, 5 voted for life. For the murder of Kim, 7 jurors voted for death, 5 voted for life. For the murder of Anna, 6 jurors voted for death, 6 jurors voted for life. A deadlock, an even split. On the question of whether a man deserved to die for killing his 5-year-old daughter, 12 people could not reach a majority. Under Florida law at the time, a deadlocked jury on a death recommendation meant an automatic recommendation of life imprisonment for that count. 6-6 meant life. That was the rule. But rules and sentences are not always the same thing. On April 19th, 1996, Judge G. Robert Barron took his seat on the bench of the Okaloosa County Circuit Court. He had heard the evidence. He had heard the arguments. He had considered the jury's recommendations. And now it was his turn to decide. He sentenced Edward James Zakarjowski II to death for the murder of Sylvia. He sentenced him to death for the murder of Kim. And then, overriding the jury's own deadlocked recommendation, he sentenced him to death for the murder of Anna, all 3 counts, death. Before the sentence was formally entered into the record, Judge Barron spoke. He looked at the case before him, and he said the following words: "This court cannot imagine a more heinous or atrocious way of dying." Now, I want to stop here for a moment, because what happened with Anna's sentence carries a weight that the rest of this case does not. In 2016, Florida passed a new law. Under that law, a judge cannot impose the death penalty unless at least 8 jurors, 8 out of 12, have voted for it. 8, not 7, not 6, 8. If that law had existed in 1996, the 7-5 votes for Sylvia and Kim would not have been enough, and the 6-6 deadlock on Anna's murder would not have been close. Under today's law, Edward Zakarjowski would not have received a single death sentence. He would have been sentenced to life in prison. But the law did not exist in 1996, and so he was sentenced to die. And then he waited for a very, very long time. Death row is not a place where things happen quickly. For Edward Zakarjowski, the years after his sentencing became a long and grinding procession of courtrooms, filings, rulings, and rejections. He had pleaded guilty to the murders. He had been sentenced to die. And yet the legal machinery kept turning. Appeal after appeal, motion after motion, argument after argument, for nearly 3 decades. On June 12, 1998, 2 years after his sentencing, the Florida Supreme Court reviewed his case on direct appeal. They considered the arguments, they reviewed the record, and they upheld all 3 death sentences. On January 25, 1999, his legal team took the case to the highest court in the United States, the Supreme Court. They filed a petition asking the court to review his case. Yet the court denied it. They would not hear it. The years passed. On November 13, 2003, the Florida Supreme Court rejected his post-conviction relief appeal, a separate category of legal challenge that allows death row inmates to raise issues that were not addressed at trial. Denied. On July 13, 2006, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, the federal appellate court that covers Florida, dismissed his federal habeas corpus appeal. A habeas corpus petition is one of the most fundamental legal tools available to a prisoner. It asks a court to examine whether the imprisonment or death sentence is lawful. The 11th Circuit said it was. Denied. On July 9, 2009, a second appeal to the 11th Circuit was filed and rejected. Denied. By January of 2016, Edward Zakarjowski had been on death row for 20 years. He was 51 years old, and the children he had murdered would have been in their 20s and 30s. Sylvia would have been in her 50s, and he was still alive, still filing motions, still working through a legal system that had not yet finished with him. He was one of 141 Florida death row inmates at that time who had exhausted all of their standard appeals. 141 people sitting in cells, waiting while the system decided what to do with them. Then, in 2016, something changed in Florida law. The state legislature passed a new requirement, the very one I mentioned earlier. Going forward, a death sentence in Florida would require a unanimous jury recommendation. All 12 jurors, not 7, not 8, all 12. The intent was to raise the bar and to ensure that no person could be sentenced to die unless an entire jury agreed. Zakrzewski's legal team saw an opening. They filed a new appeal, arguing that this change in the law should apply to his case retroactively, that the sentences handed down in 1996 under the old lower threshold should be reconsidered under the new higher standard. On May 25, 2017, the Florida Supreme Court ruled on that argument. They said no. The new law, they ruled, did not apply retroactively to cases that had already been decided. What was done in 1996 was done under the law as it existed in 1996. The new standard would not reach back and undo it. Denied. On September 20th, 2018, the Florida Supreme Court dismissed yet another appeal. The door closed again. Denied. And then the years continued to pass, quietly, without resolution, without execution. And Edward Zakrzewski grew older in a cell in Florida while Sylvia and Kim and Anna remained exactly as they had been since June 9th, 1994. Then came July 1st, 2025. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis picked up a pen and signed a death warrant. The document was formal and precise. It named Edward James Zakrzewski II. It named the crime. And it set a date for his execution, July 31st, 2025. His legal team had one final move. On July 22nd, 2025, the Florida Supreme Court denied his last state-level appeal. 6 days later, on July 28th, they brought the case before the United States Supreme Court, the same court that had denied him in 1999, and asked one final time for a stay of execution. On July 30th, 2025, one day before the scheduled execution, the United States Supreme Court denied the request. Every door that had ever been available to Edward James Zakrzewski II was now closed. 29 years, 12 separate rulings across multiple courts, every appeal denied, every argument rejected, every motion dismissed. On July 31st, 2025, there was nothing and no one left to stop it. The morning of July 31st, 2025 began the way most mornings do at Florida State Prison in Stark, a small city in Bradford County in the rural interior of the state. The sun came up. The institution operated according to its protocols. And somewhere inside that building, Edward James Zakrzewski II knew that this was the last day of his life. He had one visitor that day. The identity of that visitor was never publicly disclosed. One person came to see him before the end. He accepted the visit. He was offered the services of a spiritual advisor, a chaplain, someone to sit with him in his final hours, to pray, to offer whatever comfort religion might provide to a man in his position. He refused. He requested a final meal. In American prisons, death row inmates are traditionally given the opportunity to choose what they eat in the hours before their execution. Edward Zakrzewski chose fried pork chops, fried onions, potatoes, bacon, toast, root beer, ice cream, pie, and coffee. He ate his last meal. He waited. And at 6 o'clock in the evening, the process began. The 3-drug lethal injection protocol used by the state of Florida moves in sequence. The first drug is a sedative designed to render the inmate unconscious. The second is a paralytic agent. The third stops the heart. It is, as the state describes it, or a humane and clinical process. Clean, efficient, medical. Before the drugs were administered, Zakrzewski was given the opportunity to make a final statement. He took it. He spoke calmly, clearly, without apparent emotion. And what he said was this: I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold, calculated, clean, humane, efficient way possible. I have no complaint. The room received those words in silence, and then, without being asked, without prompting, Edward Zakarzewski began to recite a poem. The poem was by Robert Frost. It is one of the most recognizable poems in the English language. It is called Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. It is a poem about pausing at the edge of a dark and quiet forest on a winter night, about the pull of that darkness, about the weight of obligations that keep a person moving forward when part of them wants to simply stop. The final lines of that poem are among the most quoted in American literature. But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Edward Zakarzewski did not reach those lines. He began reciting the poem, and somewhere in the middle of it, as the drugs moved through his body and the sedative did what it was designed to do, he stopped. Mid-verse, mid-sentence, mid-poem, he never finished it. At 6:12 in the evening on July 31st, 2025, Edward James Zakarzewski II was pronounced dead. He was 60 years old. He became Florida's 9th execution of 2025, breaking the modern-era state record of 8 executions that had been set in 2014. 9 executions in a single year, in the most Florida had carried out in a generation. He never finished the poem. The last line of Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening reads, "And miles to go before I sleep." He ran out of miles. There is a record in Okaloosa County, Florida, a grim and unofficial ranking of the worst things human beings have done to one another in that corner of the state. The Zakarzewski family murders appear on that record. They are considered among the most heinous crimes in the history of Northwest Florida. The case is not an outlier. It is a landmark, a reference point, the kind of crime that law enforcement and prosecutors in that county still speak about when they are trying to describe what true cruelty looks like. In October of 2018, a regional report identified 17 death row inmates whose crimes had been deemed among the most severe in the Northwest Florida area. Edward Zakarzewski was among them. He had been on that list in one form or another since the day he was sentenced. But there is one more detail about Okaloosa County that deserves to be said out loud, because it is the kind of detail that makes you pause and consider what it means for a place to carry this kind of history. 4 months before Edward Zakarzewski was executed in trial, on May 1st, 2025, a man named Jeffrey Hutchinson was put to death by the state of Florida. Jeffrey Hutchinson was a Gulf War veteran. In 1998, 4 years after the Zakarzewski murders, he shot and killed his girlfriend and her 3 children in Okaloosa County, the same small stretch of the Florida Panhandle. It's 2 men, 2 sets of victims, 2 executions, same county, same year, months apart. What is it about that place? What is it about that period of time? There are no clean answers to those questions, only the weight of what happened there, only the names of the people who were lost. And the names are worth saying one more time. Sylvia Zakarzewski, born Punim, was 34 years old when she died. She had crossed an ocean, built a family, survived discrimination, and made a decision to take her life back. She deserved to grow old. She deserved to go home. She was 34 years old. Edward James Zakarzewski III, Kim, was 7 years old. He was in the 2nd grade of his life. He had his whole world ahead of him. The last thing he ever did was pick up a telephone and call his father. He was 7 years old. Anna Zakarzewski was 5 years old. She had not yet started school. She knew what it felt like to be called in for bedtime and to walk toward a parent's voice without fear. The last word she ever heard was her father calling her name. She was 5 years old. Sylvia was 34, Kim was 7, Anna was 5. Their killer spent 31 years alive after ending their lives in under 1 hour. 12 courts reviewed his case. 29 years of appeals wound through the legal system. A law that, if it had existed in 1996, would very likely have spared him from the death penalty entirely. The same jury votes that condemned him would not have been sufficient under modern Florida law. So I leave you with this question, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer in the comments below. It was what happened to Edward Zakrzewski justice? Was the execution of a 60-year-old man, 31 years after the crime, the rightful end of this story? Or was it a system that failed Sylvia and Kim and Anna twice? First by not protecting them, and then by taking 3 decades to deliver a consequence? Is justice that is delayed by 3 decades still justice? Or is it just paperwork? Tell me what you think. Leave your answer below. Every comment gets read. Every perspective matters on this channel. And if you made it to the end of this case, if you sat with Sylvia and Kim and Anna from the first phone call to the last unfinished line of a Robert Frost poem, then you already know what kind of viewer you are. You are exactly who this channel was built for. Hit subscribe, turn on your notifications, because there are more cases waiting. More names that deserve to be spoken. More stories that the world moved past too quickly. Justice does not stop with Edward Zakrzewski, and neither do we. 10 a.m., Thursday, May 21st, 2026. Inside Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee, a man is strapped to a gurney. His name is Tony Von Carruthers. He is 57 years old, and the state of Tennessee is about to kill him. The curtains are drawn. Media witnesses are seated in a darkened room on the other side of the glass. They cannot see what is happening inside that chamber. They are not allowed to. All they can do is listen, and what they hear will stay with them for the rest of their lives. A needle goes in, then another. One arm, the other arm a hand, his feet, his neck, his chest, minute after minute, puncture after puncture, 12 times, more. 90 full minutes of it. From behind the curtain, the witnesses hear him, groaning, wincing, in agony. His attorney, Maria Deliberato, is in that room. She is watching every single second of it. She will later write about this moment in the pages of the New York Times. And when she does, she will not use the word botched. She will not use the word failed. The word she will use is this: torture. At 1 p.m., 90 minutes after it began, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee picks up the phone. The execution is called off. But Tony Von Carruthers is not free. He has not been exonerated. He is not going home. He is going back to his cell, back to death row, where he has already spent 30 years waiting to die for something he says he did not do. And somewhere, right now, in a Tennessee evidence room, there is a white blanket. A blanket that was buried in a grave with 3 murder victims back in 1994. A blanket that carries the DNA of a person the state has never once, in 30 years, bothered to identify. The question is not just whether Tony Von Carruthers is innocent. The question is, does the state of Tennessee already know the answer and simply doesn't want you to find out? Before we go 1 second further, if you are watching this video and you are not yet subscribed to this channel, I need you to stop right now and fix that, because what you are about to hear is not just another true crime story. It is a warning. A warning about what happens when a justice system decides that one man's life is worth less than the inconvenience of running a single DNA test. Channels like this one get taken down, videos disappear, stories get buried, just like those 3 victims were buried in Memphis in 1994. If you leave this video without subscribing and this channel is gone tomorrow, you will never find this content again. You will never know how this story ends. So hit that subscribe button right now. I'll wait. Good. Now let's get into it. Welcome to Beyond the Crime Scene. I'm your host, and today's case is the case of Tony Von Carruthers. This is the channel where we go beyond the headlines, deeper than the news cycle, and into the details that most people never hear about. We cover death row cases, wrongful convictions, and the moments where the justice system reveals exactly what it is made of. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment right now telling us where in the world you are watching from. Now, let's get into it. Memphis, Tennessee, 1994. To understand what happened to Tony Von Carruthers, you have to first understand the city that produced this case. Memphis in 1994 was not the Memphis of tourist brochures and Beale Street blues. It was a city fractured down the middle, carved up by poverty, by drug wars, by territorial violence that spilled from street corners into living rooms and back alleys. And in that world, 3 people were about to disappear. Their names were Marcellos Anderson, Delois Anderson, and Frederick Tucker. Marcelos, known to the people who loved him as Kello, was a young man from Memphis. Delois was his mother. Frederick Tucker was a close family friend. Three people connected by love, by loyalty, by the kind of ordinary bond that exists in families and neighborhoods all across America. And then one day in 1994, all three of them were simply gone. No warning, no goodbye, gone. When their bodies were eventually discovered, what investigators found was not just a crime scene. It was something that would disturb every single person who encountered it. Marcelos Anderson, his mother Delois, and their friend Frederick Tucker had not simply been murdered and left somewhere to be found. They had been kidnapped, killed, and buried in a Memphis cemetery, hidden beneath an existing casket, beneath someone else's grave. As though whoever did this wanted to make sure these three people were not just dead, but erased. Think about that for a moment. Someone went to the effort of selecting a burial site, digging beneath an occupied grave, placing three human beings into the earth, and covering them up as though they had never existed. That level of concealment does not speak to panic. It does not speak to impulse. It speaks to planning. Memphis was shaken to its core. The pressure on law enforcement was immense. A mother and her son buried together in a stranger's grave, a city demanding answers. And in cases like this, in cities like Memphis in 1994, the pressure to produce a suspect fast is not always the same as the pressure to produce the right suspect. According to prosecutors, the motive behind the murders was drug territory. Their theory was that someone wanted to take over the local drug trade in that part of Memphis, that Marcelos Anderson was connected to that territory, and that his kidnapping was ordered as an act of domination, a message sent in the most brutal language available. The robbery, the murders, the burial, all of it, prosecutors would argue, was about control. And the name that police put forward as the man behind all of it was Tony Von Carruthers, a mother and her son, buried together in a stranger's grave in Memphis, Tennessee. In 1994, this was the kind of case that shook an entire city. And the police had their man within weeks. His name was Tony Von Carruthers. The only problem? There was not a single shred of physical evidence that he did it. Not one piece. Memphis, Tennessee, 1994 to 1996. Three men were charged in connection with the murders of Marcelos Anderson, Delois Anderson, and Frederick Tucker. Their names were Tony Von Carruthers, James Montgomery, and Jonathan Montgomery. It was Jonathan Montgomery who led police to the burial site, a detail that matters and that we will return to. But here is what you need to understand about the case against Tony Von Carruthers specifically. There was no DNA evidence linking him to the crime. There was no murder weapon tied to him. There were no fingerprints of his recovered from the scene. There were no surveillance recordings, no physical forensic traces, no material evidence of any kind that placed Tony Von Carruthers at the location where three people were kidnapped and murdered. The entire case, every single brick of the prosecution's wall, was built on witness testimony, and not just any witness testimony. Testimony from a jailhouse informant, a man who was later revealed to have been a paid police informant, a man who was being financially compensated by the same law enforcement agency that was investigating the very crime he testified about. And that fact, that the star witness against Tony Carruthers was on the state's payroll, was never disclosed to the jury. They never knew. But that is not even the most disturbing part of the forensic picture in this case. When investigators processed the crime scene, they recovered multiple unidentified latent fingerprints. Fingerprints that did not match Tony Carruthers. Fingerprints that did not match James Montgomery. Fingerprints that did not match Jonathan Montgomery. Unidentified, unmatched. And to this day, more than 30 years later, those fingerprints have never been attributed to anyone. And then there is the blanket. Buried in that Memphis cemetery grave, alongside the bodies of Marcelos Anderson, Delois Anderson, and Frederick Tucker, investigators recovered a white blanket, and on that white blanket, forensic analysis identified a robust DNA profile, a real, testable, identifiable human DNA profile, and that profile did not match Tony Carruthers. It did not match the victims. It did not match either of the co-defendants. It matched no one in the case. That DNA profile, sitting on a blanket buried with three murder victims, has never been compared to a single named suspect outside of the men who were charged. In 30 years, the state of Tennessee has never once run that comparison. Never once asked the question that any reasonable person watching this video is already asking right now. So who does it belong to? Now here is where this case takes a turn that is so extraordinary, so specific, so documented, that it should have stopped this prosecution in its tracks. In 2011, 15 years after the conviction, co-defendant James Montgomery sat down with an investigator from the Capitol Habeas Unit and made a statement under oath. He told that investigator plainly and directly that Tony Von Carruthers had no involvement whatsoever in the kidnapping or the murders of Marcellos Anderson, Delois Anderson, and Frederick Tucker. None. And then he went further. He gave investigators a name, Ronnie Irving, known on the streets of Memphis as Ronnie Eyeball Irving, described in official court documents, filed by attorneys reviewed by judges, as, and I am quoting directly here, the kidnapped man. The man James Montgomery said was actually responsible for what happened to those three people in 1994. Now here is where it gets extraordinary. Ronnie Eyeball Irving was murdered in 2002. He cannot be questioned. He cannot be arrested. He cannot stand trial. But he did not disappear without leaving a trace. Because at the Tennessee Medical Examiner's Office preserved in evidence storage, there exists a DNA sample and a set of fingerprints belonging to Ronnie Irving. The DNA from the white blanket buried with the victims exists. The DNA from Ronnie Irving exists. The fingerprints from the crime scene exist. The fingerprints of Ronnie Irving exist. All of it is there. All of it is available. All of it could be compared in a matter of days. And the state of Tennessee refuses to do it. In April of 2026, the American Civil Liberties Union formally demanded that the state run that comparison before proceeding with the execution of Tony Von Carruthers. The state said no. Courts denied the motion, and Tony Von Carruthers remained on the execution schedule. The man who the real killer named as the actual murderer is dead, but his DNA is sitting in a drawer at a Tennessee Medical Examiner's office, preserved and available. And the state of Tennessee refuses to open that drawer. A man is on death row. The DNA exists, and they will not look. Why? I need to pause here for a moment, because this next part of the story is the part that should make every single person watching this video deeply uncomfortable. If you are watching this and you are not subscribed to this channel, you are consuming story for free while Tony Carruthers sits in a cell with a new execution date on the calendar. The least, and I mean the absolute least, you can do is subscribe. It costs you nothing. It takes 3 seconds. It helps this channel stay alive long enough to keep telling stories like this one. If you will not do it for me, do it for Delois Anderson, do it for Marcellos, do it for Frederick Tucker. Do it for the 3 people buried in that Memphis cemetery whose case the state of Tennessee still refuses to fully investigate. Subscribe. Shelby County Criminal Court, Memphis, Tennessee, 1996. By the time Tony Von Carruthers went to trial, the case against him was already built on a foundation of paid testimony and concealed information. But what happened inside Shelby County Criminal Court in 1996 took the injustice of this case to a level that most people, even people who follow criminal justice closely, find almost impossible to believe. The state of Tennessee appointed a defense to represent Tony Carruthers. That attorney left the case. They appointed a second attorney. That attorney left the case, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth. 6 defense attorneys. Every single one of them walked away. When the 6th attorney left, Tony Carruthers went before the judge and asked for a 7th. The judge said no. Let that settle for a moment. A man facing 3 counts of first-degree premeditated murder, facing the death penalty, was told by a Tennessee judge that he would not be given another lawyer. And so Tony Von Carruthers, a man with severe and documented mental illness, a man with no legal training, no bar qualification, no experience navigating the machinery of a capital murder prosecution, walked into Shelby County Criminal Court alone and represented himself at trial. He was not equipped to cross-examine witnesses. He was not equipped to challenge forensic procedures. He was not equipped to expose the fact that the state's key witness was a paid informant. He was not equipped to do any of the things a competent defense attorney would have done in that courtroom, because he was not a competent defense attorney. He was a mentally ill man who had been abandoned by the system that was supposed to protect him, and then thrown into the deepest possible end of that same system with no lifeline. In 1996, both Tony Von Carruthers and James Montgomery were convicted on 3 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. Both were sentenced to death. And Tony Von Carruthers was sent to death row at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee, where he would spend the next 30 years of his life. What makes this even more staggering is the historical weight of what Tennessee was preparing to do. If Tony Von Carruthers had been executed as scheduled, he would potentially have been the first person in over 100 years in the United States to be executed after representing himself at trial. 100 years. That is not a footnote. That is a landmark. That is a verdict the entire legal history of this country was watching. And then comes the detail that cuts deepest of all. In 2015, 19 years after both men were sentenced to death, James Montgomery's conviction was overturned. He accepted a plea deal. And James Montgomery, the co-defendant, the man who had been convicted alongside Tony Von Carruthers of the same 3 murders, walked out of prison and went home. The same man who later told investigators that Tony was innocent. The same man who named Ronnie Eyeball Irving as the real perpetrator. The same man whose testimony, had it been heard at the right moment, in the right courtroom, before the right judge, might have changed everything. He went home, and Tony stayed on death row, alone. The man convicted alongside Tony Von Carruthers walked out of prison in 2015. He told investigators Tony was innocent. He named the real killer. That killer's DNA is in a Tennessee evidence drawer, untouched, uncompared, unexamined. And in May of 2026, with every single one of those facts already on the record, the state of Tennessee strapped Tony to a gurney and tried to end his life anyway. What happened inside that death chamber is something you are not prepared for. When Tony Von Carruthers arrived at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee in 1996, he was a man in his late 20s. He had no legal training. He had documented mental illness. He had just been convicted of 3 murders on the testimony of a paid informant, without a single piece of physical evidence, and without a qualified attorney standing beside him in that courtroom. And now he had a cell, and a death sentence, and time. What most people do not understand about death row is that it is not simply a place where people wait to die. It is a place where time becomes both a weapon and a lifeline. Every year that passes is another year closer to an execution date. But it is also another year to file another motion, find another attorney, uncover another piece of evidence, and ask a court one more time to look at the facts. For 30 years, that is exactly what Tony Von Carruthers did. He filed appeals. They were denied. He found attorneys willing to look at his case. They filed motions. Courts denied those too. The legal system that had failed him in 1996 continued to fail him, year after year, motion after motion, ruling after ruling. And yet he kept going, because when the alternative is a needle in your arm, you keep going. In September of 2021, Tony Von Carruthers did something remarkable, without an attorney, on his own. A man with no legal training, operating from inside a maximum security prison cell, filed his own pro se motion at the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals. He asked the court to order a fingerprint comparison, to take the unmatched fingerprints recovered from the 1994 crime scene and compare them to the preserved fingerprints of Ronnie Irving, sitting at the Tennessee Medical Examiner's office. It was a precise, targeted, logical legal request. Compare this evidence to this suspect. Answer the question that should have been answered 30 years ago. That motion was filed in September 2021, and as of the morning of his scheduled execution in May 2026, it had still not been resolved, still pending, still sitting in the system. A self-represented death row inmate had correctly identified the exact forensic comparison that could determine his guilt or innocence, and the court had not even fully processed the request in 5 years. Then, on April 6, 2026, the American Civil Liberties Union formally entered the fight. They filed an application at the Tennessee Supreme Court in Nashville, a motion requesting both a stay of execution and a court order demanding DNA testing before the scheduled May 21st execution date. 3 days later, the ACLU filed additional motions specifically demanding that the state compare the white blanket DNA and the unmatched crime scene fingerprints to the preserved biological material of Ronnie Irving. They laid it out in plain language. The evidence exists. The suspect is identifiable. The comparison is straightforward. Run the test. The state of Tennessee did not run the test. On May 7, 2026, the ACLU released a public statement that pulled no punches. It read, in part, "The state is preparing to execute Tony Carruthers on May 21st, even though serious questions remain about whether they have the right person." Serious questions about whether they have the right person. 2 weeks before the execution, on May 18, 2026, 3 days before the scheduled execution, the Tennessee Supreme Court in Nashville issued its ruling on the DNA motion. Denied, the court concluded that the motion did not meet the legal threshold required to compel testing. That same week, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals denied the fingerprint comparison request as well. 2 courts. 2 denials. 3 days before a man was scheduled to die, Amnesty International published an urgent action alert. Amnesty USA followed. Both organizations stated plainly that proceeding with the execution of Tony Von Carruthers would constitute a violation of international law, citing his documented mental disability, the absence of a fair trial, and the existence of unexamined evidence that could prove his innocence. From across the world, people responded. Strangers who had never heard the name Tony Von Carruthers before 2026 read the facts of his case and came to the same conclusion. Over 130,000 people signed petitions demanding that Tennessee halt the execution. 130,000 people from different countries, different languages, different walks of life. All of them looking at the same set of facts and saying the same thing. This is wrong. And here is perhaps the most haunting detail in this entire case. Tony Carruthers reportedly did not believe he was actually going to be executed. His attorney said he believed the whole thing was a government pressure tactic, a scheme to force him into accepting a plea deal that didn't even exist. That is the mental state of the man the state of Tennessee was preparing to kill, a man so disconnected from the reality of his own situation. After 3 decades of institutional confinement, after years of denied appeals, after a lifetime inside a system that had never once treated him as fully human, that he could not even process the fact that his death had been scheduled, approved, and was now 48 hours away. 130,000 people signed a petition for a man most of them had never heard of before 2026. Strangers from different countries, different languages. All of them said, "This is wrong." And yet here you are, watching this video, and you still have not subscribed. You know what happens when channels like this do not grow? These stories disappear. The Tony Carruthers of this world get executed and forgotten. Subscribe to this channel and make sure that never happens on your watch. Death Chamber, Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, Nashville, Tennessee, Thursday, May 21, 2026, 10 a.m. The morning of May 21, 2026 began the way execution mornings always begin at Riverbend, quietly, with procedure, with protocol, with the clinical language of a state carrying out what it considers to be a lawful act. But before Tony Von Carruthers was even brought into the death chamber, his attorney Maria Deliberato was still fighting. On the morning of the execution itself, she filed a last-minute emergency appeal to the Tennessee Supreme Court. This appeal challenged the medical qualifications of the physician who had been contracted by the state to insert the central intravenous line required by Tennessee's execution protocol. She was not filing paperwork for the sake of it. She had reason to believe that the person tasked with performing a medical procedure on her client, a procedure that required professional skill and anatomical knowledge, may not have had the qualifications to do it safely. The Tennessee Supreme Court denied the appeal, and so at 10 a.m., the execution of Tony Von Carruthers was scheduled to proceed. In the viewing room, media witnesses took their seats. Among them was Stephen Hale, a reporter from the Nashville Banner, one of the Tennessee outlets that had been covering this case and fighting for greater transparency around the state's execution process. The curtains were drawn. The witnesses could not see into the death chamber. They could not observe what was happening on the other side of the glass. They could only sit in the dark and wait, and then it started. According to the Tennessee Department of Corrections, medical staff quickly established the primary intravenous line. That part, they said, went without difficulty. But Tennessee's execution protocol requires not one IV line, but 2, a primary line and a mandatory backup line. And when the medical team turned their attention to finding a second suitable vein, that is when everything fell apart. They tried his arm, it failed. They tried his other arm, it failed. They tried his hand, it failed. They moved to his feet, those failed too. They attempted his jugular vein, the large vein running along the side of the neck. They tried to access it. They could not establish a usable line. At some point during the procedure, an IV line inserted near his shoulder began to backfill. Blood moved backward through the line, toward his chest. Tony Von Carruthers experienced severe chest pain. They then attempted to insert a central line, a larger catheter placed directly into a major vein in the chest, a procedure that, under normal circumstances, requires a trained physician operating under sterile conditions with imaging equipment. They attempted it. They abandoned it. Through all of it, on the other side of the curtain, in the darkened viewing room, the media witnesses sat and listened. And what they heard was Tony Von Carruthers groaning, not once, not briefly, in sustained audible agony for the duration of 90 minutes. 90 minutes. Stephen Hale of the Nashville Banner sat in that room for all of it. He could see nothing, he could only hear. And what he heard in that chamber at Riverbend on the morning of May 21st, 2026, was the sound of a state trying and failing to kill a man while that man suffered in the dark. Maria Deliberato was watching. As Tony's attorney, as his legal advocate, as the person who had spent years fighting for his life, she was present in that room. She watched her client punctured more than a dozen times across his body. She watched trained medical personnel fail, repeatedly, to do what they had been commissioned to do. And when it was over, when the execution was finally, mercifully called off, she did not use measured legal language to describe what she had witnessed. She called it torture, not negligence, not mismanagement, not a procedural failure, torture. She would later write about those 90 minutes in a first-person account published in the New York Times. She would describe walking into that institution prepared to watch her client die, and instead watching him be subjected to something that she could not in good conscience call anything other than what it was. What happened on May 21st, 2026 was not an isolated incident in Tennessee's history with capital punishment. It was the sixth failed lethal injection execution in that state in less than 10 years. 6 times in under a decade, the state of Tennessee had attempted to execute a human being by lethal injection and encountered catastrophic complications. And on May 26, 2026, the Death Penalty Information Center published a detailed report concluding that this most recent botched attempt raised serious and urgent questions about the medical qualifications of Tennessee's execution team. 90 minutes. That is how long the state of Tennessee spent trying to find a way to kill Tony Von Carruthers, a man whose conviction rests entirely on the word of a paid informant, a man whose co-defendant says he is innocent, a man whose guilt or innocence could be resolved with a single DNA comparison, one that the state refuses to run. And yet there they were, needle after needle, arm, hand, foot, neck, chest, while 130,000 people outside those walls were screaming for it to stop. In 1996, 12 jurors voted to convict Tony Carruthers and send him to death row. Today, most of them probably do not even remember his name. History has a way of remembering the people who stayed silent when it mattered. You are watching this video right now, which means you are not silent. You already care. But caring without acting is just watching. Subscribe to this channel, share this video. Comment your thoughts. Because 10 years from now, when the full truth of this case comes out, and it will come out, you want to be on the right side of it. Nashville, Tennessee, May 21st, 2026, 1 p.m. onwards. At 1 p.m. on Thursday, May 21st, 2026, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee issued an official 1-year stay of execution for Tony Von Carruthers. With that single act, the execution was postponed, not canceled, not reversed, not accompanied by any order to examine the DNA evidence or review the fingerprint comparisons. Simply postponed. Tony Von Carruthers was taken off the gurney, moved out of the death chamber, and returned to his cell at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. He was alive, but he was not safe, because a 1-year stay of execution means exactly what it sounds like. The clock had not stopped, it had simply been reset, and somewhere in the calendar a new date was already forming. Somewhere in May of T27, when the state of Tennessee would be entitled to try again. Attorney Maria Deliberato and the ACLU did not wait to respond. In the hours and days following the botched execution attempt, they moved quickly to file legal arguments that what had happened to Tony Von Carruthers in that death chamber constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment of the United States Constitution. The argument was straightforward. The state had subjected a human being to 90 minutes of repeated needle punctures, failed vascular access attempts, a back-filling IV line, severe chest pain, and documented agony. To bring that same man back in May of 2027 and attempt it again, knowing what had already been inflicted on him, would not be an execution. It would be something the Constitution explicitly forbids. Those arguments were being prepared even as Tony sat back in his cell, Meanwhile, in courtrooms and editorial offices across Tennessee, a parallel battle was being fought around the question of transparency. The Nashville Banner and other Tennessee media organizations were actively pursuing a federal lawsuit demanding that media witnesses be given the legal right to observe IV line placement during executions. What had happened in the viewing room on May 21st, where trained journalists sat in the dark for 90 minutes and were permitted only to listen, was not, in the view of these outlets, consistent with the public's right to know what is being carried out in its name. If the state of Tennessee is going to execute people, they argued, the public has a right to see exactly how it is being done. That lawsuit was ongoing. And then there was the matter of the drugs themselves. Tennessee had not simply resumed executions after a long pause without controversy. The state had previously imposed a 3-year moratorium on executions, a halt triggered by a significant scandal. An independent review of Tennessee's execution protocols had found that none of the lethal injection drugs used in 7 prior executions had undergone complete and proper chemical testing. 7 executions. 7 times the state had administered compounds into human beings without verifying that those compounds met the required standards. And in the investigation that followed, 2 state officials were found to have incorrectly testified under oath, to have stood in front of a court and stated that proper testing was being conducted, when it was not. Those are not accusations, those are findings. And with that history as the backdrop, the state of Tennessee had resumed executions, and on May 21, 2026, had attempted to execute Tony Von Carruthers. On May 26, 2026, the Death Penalty Information Center published its full report on the botched execution. The conclusions were stark. The organization stated that the attempt raised serious questions about whether Tennessee's execution team possessed the medical competency required to conduct executions, and then on June 1, 2026, today, Maria Deliberato published her first-person account in the New York Times. In it, she described walking into Riverbend Maximum Security Arts Institution, prepared to witness her client's death. She described what she saw. She described the needles, the failed attempts, the sounds, the 90 minutes. She used the word torture. She put her name on it and published it in one of the most widely read newspapers in the world. And through all of it, through the stay, through the lawsuits, through the reports and the op-eds and the constitutional arguments, one thing remains unchanged. The white blanket is still in evidence storage. The DNA profile on that blanket is still uncompered. Ronnie Irving's preserved biological samples are still sitting at the Tennessee Medical Examiner's office, and Tony Von Carruthers is still on death row, with a new execution date approaching, waiting to find out whether the state of Tennessee will ever agree to answer the one question that matters most. Tony Von Carruthers, 57 years old, born in Memphis, convicted in 1996 on the testimony of a paid informant with no DNA match, no fingerprint match, no murder weapon, and no physical evidence. His co-defendant James Montgomery walked free in 2015 and told investigators Tony was innocent. The man he named as the real killer, Ronnie Eyeball Irving, is dead, but his DNA is preserved in a Tennessee Medical Examiner's office right now. And on a white blanket buried with 3 murder victims in a Memphis cemetery in 1994, there is an unidentified DNA profile that has never been compared to Ronnie Irving. Not once in 30 years. On May 21, 2026, in Nashville, Tennessee, the state spent 90 minutes trying to kill this man. They punctured him more than a dozen times. His attorney called it torture. His attorney wrote about it in the New York Times today, June 1, 2026. Governor Bill Lee gave him 1 more year. 1 year. If the state of Tennessee executes Tony Von Carruthers in May 2027, and that white blanket DNA later proves he was innocent, Tennessee will not have a wrongful conviction on its hands. They will have an execution, and everyone who knew and said nothing will carry that. Now listen to me very carefully. If you watched this entire video and you are still not subscribed, I genuinely need you to stop and ask yourself why. I am not being dramatic. This channel exists for one reason: to make sure that people like Tony Von Carruthers are not forgotten, that their stories are told, that the facts are put in front of as many people as possible before it is too late to matter. Every subscriber this channel gains is 1 more person in the room when the next execution date approaches. 1 more person who can share the video. 1 more person who can leave a comment. One more person who can say, I knew about this, I was paying attention. If you will not subscribe, fine. But do not leave this video in silence. Go to the comments right now and tell me what you think. Tell me if you believe Tony Von Carruthers is innocent. Tell me if you think the state of Tennessee is hiding something. Tell me if you think the DNA should be tested. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me anything. Because silence, in this case, in this story, at this moment, is the most dangerous thing of all. Tony Von Carruthers has 1 year, and the clock is already running.